Order! Order! You are an incorrigible delinquent at times. Behave yourself, man!
And now, as ever, to the front pages. As I suggested at the beginning of the programme, lots of Boris Johnson. That is quite a silhouette, I have to say there. Gove and Patel back... Patel as well, less Patel. Gove and Patel back Boris's vision for Brexit, says the Sunday Telegraph. A slightly less enthusiastic Mail on Sunday. Tories at war over Boris's move to oust PM. The Sunday Times has its own splash there about tuition fees. We'll talk about that as well. And they say Boris revives Brexit dream team. And then finally there's the Observer leading on the Parsons Green story. And Boris Johnson ought to be fired, angry Tories tell me. Well, we'll be talking about whether this is actually a leadership bid or not, what's going on. But as you were hearing in the news, Boris Johnson himself has been a bit camera shy. The way these things work, I get onto my phone and I come to my text messages, and about the first thing I see is a message from Boris's man. It says, Boris's man says that this is not a leadership bid, this is just an attempt to get a better Brexit, and that he's in favour of payments during the transitional period, not just afterwards. So Boris is already responding through his man by phone to people like me. That's how it works. Now, Amanda Patel, you are not backing Boris, as I suggested earlier on. Is there genuine anger, do you think, in the Cabinet about this?
There's incredulity. I use, my little phone comes in handy as well, and it was bouncing last night. And the first word that came up was Boris, moron. That was from a cabinet minister. Now, they are incandescent about this intervention. They were blindsided. It's not even known. No one could even say, I have not spoken to the Prime Minister, no one could even say if the Prime Minister had seen it before he published his 4,000-word epic, which is only 1,000 words less than Theresa May's speech on Friday.
But yet, it's slightly odd, because it is a very optimistic, positive vision of Brexit post getting out and all the rest.
I know you've got to do all this kind of fair thing, but you used to be
I'm trying to do the fair thing.
You used to be a political editor. You know that something like this, an intervention, it has to be cleared through the Prime Minister's team. It should have been cleared through the Cabinet. None of that has happened. Boris he's freelancing.
And yet there is not a word in the 4,000 words which is actually contradicting government policy.
That may be true, but he's not even part of the Brexit negotiating team. I mean, one of the comments last night that was made to me was that apart from being, what was it, divisive, self-indulgent, the biggest sin was he was just ignorant. He doesn't know they're at a very delicate part of the negotiation at the moment. And this big buffoon storms in and stomps all over it. And
you can't call him the Foreign Secretary
as for Michael Gove backing you, crikey, when Michael Gove's backing you, you're really in trouble. He's still got the knife marks in his back from last year. OK, tell us what you really think in a second. Francis O'Grady, we've got the Telegraph there, I think, the Times.
It's the Sunday Times
and
coverage. This piece is really trying to understand what is Boris's motivation for what some might see as a bit of a kamikaze act, and it's suggesting that he feels personally that his reputation was trashed during the referendum, particularly in respect of that 350 million
for the NHS
on the side of the bus. And it feels like he is resurrecting that promise, which was exposed as the biggest whopper of the campaign.
He's repeated it today, and he clearly thinks it can still happen. Is there not a kind of philosophical division going on inside the Conservative Party now between people who basically want us to stay alongside the EU, be a kind of European country after Brexit, and those like Boris who say, no, look out to the rest of the world, look out to the Commonwealth, look out to America?
Well, I think we're seeing that very sharp division now between the pragmatists who are looking for a deal with the EU and Boris, who is prepared to jump over that cliff edge with Michael Gove, like Butch Cassidy and the Sundance Kid, and take us into an extreme Brexit that would damage workers' rights and jobs.
John, you spend your time in Washington and elsewhere in North America. How is Boris seen there?
They don't quite use the same words that Amanda has used to describe Boris, but there is a flavour of that. And also, just imagine you're a British diplomat in Washington and you're trying to tell the American elite, the ruling class, what Britain's policy is and where the government stands on Brexit. and you've got all these competing narratives, completely different stories being told, and it's incredibly difficult because it does look slightly shambolic what is unfolding, and it's sort of almost easier to report to London what the government, the administration of Donald Trump is doing than explain to the Americans what the government of Theresa May is doing. And I think that is a real issue.
But there is a real choice to be made here for Britain, isn't there? What kind of country are we going to be after Brexit, which is partly what Boris Johnson's article addresses. A senior businessman said to me last week, he said, we should join NAFTA, for instance. There is a choice between the American model and the British model. When it comes to cars and much else, the American model is doing much better than the European model.
The American model is starting to power, and there's a lot of economic confidence about, in America at the moment about the changes that are coming and that may be being made. So, yeah, there is a choice to be made. But, I mean, I also think that, everyone's saying, oh, well, Donald Trump, he supports Brexit, therefore it's going to be very easy to make a great trade deal. Let's see when it comes to the detail of the negotiations how easy that will be, because who needs that trade deal more? Right. Is it America or is it Britain? And I think that Donald Trump, the great negotiator, is going to try and drive a pretty hard bargain.
Well, we've talked about leadership bids and so forth. Let's move to another leadership bid, as it were. Not a leadership bid, a successful bid to be leader of his party, but somebody who wants to be Prime Minister, which is Vince Cable. He's given an interview to The Observer, I think, in which he says in terms that he thinks he can be the next Prime Minister.
I mean, it's extraordinary, and you just kind of realise how fast British politics moves at the moment and how fluid it is. That, you have Vince Cable setting out his case, why he could lead the Liberal Democrats back from the wilderness. It was only 2 years ago that he lost his seat and everyone was saying that Vince Cable's career was completely over.
Totally finished, wasn't it?
Totally finished.
Yeah. Too old.
And David Cameron was absolutely safe as Prime Minister, having won a majority. David Cameron's gone and it's now Theresa May, can she sack Boris or not? I just think that everything is incredibly fluid, and anyone who thinks there are certainties over the next 3 years, whether it be in US politics or whether it be in UK politics, is kidding themselves. And, Vince Cable probably sees that there's an opportunity.
We don't know what's around the corner in security terms either, Amanda. Let's turn to the Parsons Green story, if you don't mind. The saddest aspect of this is this couple who had been doing the right thing, fostering lots of kids over a long period of time, honoured by the Queen, and then this happens to them.
Well, they've even, the woman there, it's hundreds, I think it's nearly 300 children that they've taken in, and they take especially troubled teenagers, which are the most difficult to foster. And then, it looks as though, and of course this all is alleged, we don't know yet, but the papers have come down very strongly saying that, this foster kid he's the bucket bomber. And he was in their home, and it just must be so, it must really, foster carers have a lot of faith in humanity. That's what drives them.
It's a really tough thing to do.
And for them to have that challenged in this way, I just feel so sorry for them this morning.
Francis, the Sunday Times splash there is a big story in a sense. It's a new policy on tuition fees. The government are going to cut tuition fees, it suggests, by £5,000. Quite a lot.
Yep. They're suggesting that the Chancellor in his budget is preparing to cap tuition fees to £7,500 and maybe do something about what I think a lot of people really worry about, which is those interest repayments, which currently running at double RPI inflation. And I think there's, again, a political calculation here that many in the Conservative Party looked at Labour, saw their promises on tuition fees and students and thought, we'll have some of that. That's why they got the Young vote. We need to move in that direction. But I think it's much more complicated than that. In fact, the story points out that being a student is no guarantee of a decent wage at the end of it. We've seen young people on very low wages, on 0 hours contracts, no guarantee of a career, even though they've devoted 3 or 4 years of their life to study.
And there's been a lot of talk over the summer about paid gaps and pay differentials across the board. University vice-chancellors have come under a lot of flack, and this will presumably cut the amount of money going into universities in a significant way.
Well, I think that's an issue, and certainly there's been concern about greed at the top, but perhaps a bit more attention needs to be paid to what's happening to teaching staff, who themselves are very often on insecure contracts, and that impacts on the quality of our courses at a time when, of course, Brexit means we might be seeing fewer overseas students to subsidise the funding.
Right, we've mentioned Donald Trump already, but let's turn directly to what has been a remarkably important week in American politics, John Sopel.
Yeah.
We've had two initiatives, really, from the President.
Yes, it's been an extraordinary... I've been in Britain the last 2 weeks trying to selling a book about life in Trump's America called If Only They Didn't Speak English. But, I mean, one of the things that doesn't get covered in the book is the fact that Donald Trump has suddenly started reaching out to the Democrats. Now, it's partly to jab the Republicans in the eye, the leadership in the House and in the Senate, because he's furious with them. But suddenly he's doing deals over the debt ceiling. And so the Washington Post there, with little to lose, Democrats cautiously share the driver's seat with Trump. If we then go to the New York Times, bewilderment by that rarest of sightings in Washington, bipartisanship. And that's as well going on about what will happen to the dreamers, the young kind of Hispanics who've come across the border illegally but were given some kind of amnesty. And then you've got the Wall Street Journal, I think this is very interesting as well, if I could just open that up as well, saying US seeks to avoid quitting Paris deal, the climate change deal. Top officials say, now the White House has denied that, but maybe there is some kind of movement there as well. So
it feels like a huge series of screeching U-turns. Is this because Trump is now beginning to worry about his base? I mean, his base won't like this, but he's worried that he hasn't got the support in Congress for anything he wants to do?
He did a deal with the Democrats over the debt ceiling and getting funding for Hurricane Harvey, and suddenly he's getting applause. And I think he remembered that he quite liked the sound of applause coming from all sorts of different quarters. And so I think it's emboldened him to do other things. But whichever way he moves, there will be people waiting to attack that he's either betraying his base, and there'll be Democrats who'll be fearful about what will happen if you do a deal with Donald Trump. It is a fascinating development over the last 10 days.
So much to talk about. We're nearly out of time, but Amanda, there's one really important story for all of us in the Sunday Times.
I know you love a good weather story,
I do love a good weather story, thank you.
Unfortunately, the forecast is that this is going to be one of the worst autumns on record, and after our terrible Eileen storm, which 83-mile-per-hour winds we had with that.
83?
83.
You're comparing that to Irma. you call that weather?
No,
and Hurricane Harvey?
You're storm bragging.
OK.
Give me a break.
One final political storm, Francis.
Yeah.
1 million public sector jobs have been lost, is that right?
Yeah, so the government has been saying, oh, we can't afford to give nurses and firefighters a pay rise because we're protecting jobs and services. Yeah. But this Sunday Mirror story from the GMB shows very clearly we've lost nearly 1 million public sector jobs since 2010.
And yet, despite everything, unemployment is down, employment is up, the economy is doing rather well.
I think it's the big debate now is about quality of employment, that people don't want 0 hours jobs. They do want our public service workers to be paid fairly. And, you know, all of us want fair pay.
We all want fair pay. Thank you very much indeed. That was very interesting.
Let's dive into the front pages out this morning and start with The Observer, shall we? It leads on the raid of that house in Surrey carried out yesterday by police in connection with Friday's attack on the Tube. The Mail on Sunday says the Conservative Party is at war after Boris Johnson wrote an article yesterday setting out what he wants to see from Brexit. The Sunday Telegraph says that 2 of the Foreign Secretary's cabinet colleagues, Michael Gove and Priti Patel, back his vision for life outside the EU. The Sunday Times leads on plans by the Chancellor Philip Hammond to lower tuition fees in a bid to woo young voters back to the Conservatives. The Huffington Post features comments by Rochdale abuse whistleblower Sarah Robotham, who defends Labour MP Sarah Champion over her comments about abuse and race. She says, we should not be shutting people down because we don't like what they're saying. And BuzzFeed leads on the arrest of a 21-year-old man, the second arrest made in connection with Friday's attack at Parsons Green. Well, to take us through their selection from the papers, we're joined by the writer and journalist Ellie Mae O'Hagan and the political columnist for The Spectator, Katie Bowles. Very good morning to you both. And let's start, shall we, with Boris Johnson. An appropriate place to start, given that most of the papers are getting quite exercised by his intervention. And you're looking inside the Telegraph, pages 4 and 5.
So Tory unity is not looking that great today. This is after Boris wrote his article in the Saturday Telegraph, where he unveiled his vision for Brexit. And that has ruffled quite a lot of feathers. There are calls from unnamed Tory MPs for him to be fired. And I think just now in the Marr show, we had Amber Rudd said that she hadn't had time to read it because she was too busy dealing with the terrorist attack.
I mean, is it fair for this to be strictly, directly interpreted as Boris Johnson stirring the pot. I mean, Fraser Nelson, for example, from The Spectator, is suggesting, actually, instead, it's just good to hear from the strongest voice on Brexit once again. I
think the timing was very strange, you know, to do this on the day of the terrorist attacks. It was an odd choice. Also, you know, he is contradicting the Theresa May's stated position. I don't think that's particularly helpful for the Tories. So I can't really see why he would be doing it other than to stir the pot and possibly position himself for the leadership. It doesn't really seem helpful to the country or to the Tories themselves for him to have done this at this particular point in time.
And I wonder how much we can read into the fact that Priti Patel and one Michael Gove have lent their support to his words.
Yeah, again, not directly, we're just told that they do. But yeah, I think what it is Theresa May has a speech coming up in Florence where we're expecting her to actually elaborate on her position and tell us a bit more about Brexit means Brexit. And that means that the Eurosceptic wing of the party are quite worried that she's going to make some concessions that she can't take back, such as on the transition period or the Brexit bill. So although Boris, and I do agree with my editor on this, is very good at making people excited about things and putting the positive argument for Brexit, the fact that he's done it so soon to this speech suggests there might be other, you know, tactics at play.
See, I thought there had been, you know, a rare outbreak of consensus within the cabinet when it came to transition, and there's absolutely nothing in the 4,000-word vision that mentions that.
Well, no. I mean, I think that's exactly why I think it's such an odd thing to do. I think I totally agree with Katie that, you know, it's all centred around this speech coming up, and I think he really has undermined Theresa May by expressing his opinions at this particular time, because he's basically just slated the exact position that we expect her to lay out very shortly, and she's already very weak, and that only weakens her further. So I just can't see why he would be doing this for any reason other than to further his own interests, really.
Yeah, but behind the scenes, I think there are worries from figures such as Boris about if you have too long a transition period, if you actually still leave, they are worried that it might not happen. And that does create a sore point with the speech he's giving.
Let's turn to the front page of the Times, and an interesting kind of policy development from the Conservatives as regards tuition fees. I mean, look, we understand that the Conservatives have a real problem when it comes to, well, practically everyone under the age of 45. I mean, how far does this go, do you think, to redressing the balance?
I think at the moment, we were talking about this earlier, but they risk looking like they're just doing what Jeremy Corbyn wants to do, but a much more diluted version. And if they are going to stand by tuition fees, and lots of quite progressive arguments for tuition fees, then there are other things they could do, such as look at the maintenance grants, which which you don't get so much anymore, and that means that lots of people from disadvantaged backgrounds might be put off. But still, the figures show that at the moment, even with tuition fees, you're having more people from disadvantaged backgrounds go.
What do you make of it, Ellie? I mean, the fact is, even if the fee that you pay is reduced, I mean, the interest on those loans is still pretty staggering. You're going to still be leaving university with a mountain of debt.
Yeah, I think I basically have two responses to this. I think, first of all, it shows, as does the last story that we discussed, that actually Labour is setting the agenda at the moment, which, you know, in the past couple of years is quite unusual, but you know, since the election, things have changed, and now it does seem like Labour is setting the agenda and the Tories are following, and I think a lot of that is because of Theresa May's weakness and because of infighting within the Tory party. This, I think, is a really, to just put it in just completely candid terms, is a really daft proposal, because if you're a young person and tuition fees are the things that drive you to the polls, are you going to vote for the party that cuts them by £5,000, or are you going to vote for the party that abolishes them? I think all it does is reinforce Labour's frames about, you know, tuition fees are bad and we should get rid of them. And then it puts the Tories in this kind of halfway house position, which for me, as someone who is opposed to tuition fees, is great. But in terms of a tactic for the Tories, I think it's pretty self-defeating, and I don't think they should do it. Well,
two words which always follow tuition fees these days, Liberal Democrats. Let's go inside the Observer. Vince Cable believes he can be Prime Minister.
Yeah, I mean, right now there is a Lib Dem conference occurring. We might not have heard that much about it, but lots of people are gathered in Bournemouth, I believe. And I think to get headlines, the Lib Dems are having to resort to increasingly quite desperate tactics. We heard that I think Vince Cable last week compared Theresa May to someone who was handcuffed to a radiator, and that was how he said the Brexiteers were treating her, and now he's saying it's going to be PM. But it just shows that they don't really have that much to say, so they're having to say quite drastic things.
And is there a point to the Liberal Democrats these days, Ellie?
I mean, they represent a very, I would say, very hardcore Remainer position, which I think is actually very, in the public, the general public, is actually a really minority position. Yes, there are people who want to vote Remain, but not as enthusiastically as perhaps the Liberal Democrats do. I think something wider is going on with the Liberal Democrats, which is basically the kind of politics they represent, this kind of centrist politics, is on the wane. And I think one area where we do disagree is that we were having a chat about this earlier, and Katie was saying she feels that it's because they're so tied to Europe and this Remain position, whereas I feel that the Remain position articulated in the referendum lost precisely because it was tied to this kind of centrist politics that is dying at the moment all over the world. Like if you look in Spain, in Germany, in America, you know, these kind of politicians are losing, and the sort of new left and the far right are the two forces that are in the insurgency. And I just think that the Liberal Democrats, it's all just part of that decline.
Well, I'm sure they'll have fun in Bournemouth anyway. Katie, Ellie, mate, thank you both for joining us this morning, taking us through the papers.
So what are the really big political stories that are making the headlines this morning? The latest on the investigation into the Parsons Green terror attack is dominating the news. Police have revealed that they are holding a second man in connection with the bombing. He was arrested in West London late last night, and that follows the arrest of an 18-year-old man in Dover yesterday. The Sunday Times reports that the government is planning to slash tuition fees. The paper says the proposals are being drawn up for the Chancellor's autumn budget amid frustration that some universities are not offering value for money. The fallout from Boris Johnson's Brexit intervention yesterday continues. The Mail on Sunday claims Tories are at war over Boris's move to oust the Prime Minister. But the Foreign Secretary himself took to Twitter last night to claim he was looking forward to the Prime Minister's Florence speech and that he was all behind Theresa for a glorious Brexit. The Liberal Democrat leader Vince Cable has not wasted the opportunity to weigh in. He's calling Boris Johnson a Poundland Donald Trump and says the Prime Minister ought to sack him. Well, the Home Secretary Amber Rudd has been speaking on the Andrew Marr show this morning, and she was asked whether Boris Johnson's vision for Brexit that was published in yesterday's papers was helpful or unhelpful.
I don't want him managing the Brexit process. What we've got is Theresa May managing that process. She's driving the car, to continue the allegory, and I'm going to make sure that, as far as I'm concerned and the rest of the Cabinet are concerned, we help her do that. This is a difficult moment.
So this is backseat driving, in effect?
Yeah, you could call it backseat driving, absolutely.
That was Amber Rudd speaking on the Andrew Marr show a little earlier. Well, to unpack some of that, I'm going to turn to our regular gang of political gurus who are going to give us all their insights into what's happening behind the headlines. So we'll turn to Amber Rudd and what she had to say in a moment. But first, Tom, you've got some news for us on how this all came about. Why was this huge article from Boris Johnson in the Telegraph yesterday?
I think it's incredibly complicated, actually. There's the personal Boris Johnson ambitions, which is certainly at play here. Perhaps the fear of a younger generation coming up and his great chances at leadership are going to waste. So he wanted to have his voice heard for those stakes. But the Brexit politics is absolutely fascinating. Boris Johnson, remember, was in the Caribbean last week, serving Queen and Country and delivering aid and flying the flag. Meanwhile, at home, Philip Hammond, Theresa May and Amber Rudd had a meeting to discuss her Brexit speech, and then the stories started to emerge that she was prepared to make this great big new offer of transition payments to access a single market and the customs union for this potential 2 or 3 years of transition. Now that blows your 350 million quid a week for the NHS clean out the water, at least for 2 or 3 years. And that is obviously something up which Boris felt he could not put. Hence, come out early, fire your barrage first before Theresa May does her speech. But there's another subtext, which is Boris Johnson has been wanting to make his own Brexit speech for weeks now. We were ready to take a great big op-ed from him saying, you know, going into the day itself, and he wasn't allowed to do that. So you sort of felt this, and I think some of us for a while we felt this sort of Boris Johnson pressure cooker rattling away for months on end now, and it's no surprise that it eventually exploded.
And it's clear that there is huge frustration in Number 10 about this having been published, particularly coming just before the Prime Minister's about to make her speech in Florence. But Isabel, he actually made a very cogent, passionate case in favour of Brexit. Almost made you wonder why we don't hear more from him as somebody who is quite persuasive on how it could be good for Britain.
Well, and that's what supporters of Boris Johnson would say, that here is somebody providing real leadership at a time when they feel leadership is lacking. The first and last sections of that speech were very patriotic. You know, it was pretty hard to argue with, you know, let's not talk Britain down. You know, my friends, there are too many people who are doubting our ability to do wonderfully once we cast off the shackles of the EU. I think what struck me about the article is how wide-ranging it is. I mean, 4,000 words, you know, somebody has worked long in newspapers. It's unusual to carry an op-ed of anything like that length.
Well,
normally,
it was a speech. Here's the thing, this is the thing he wanted to say out loud, and
right.
it was reduced
So,
to the Daily Telegraph.
Yeah, because we understand the Prime Minister's speech is only going to be, well, it's going to be 5,000 words, so this was practically the same length.
Absolutely, and the fact that it roved all over areas which aren't his brief is very unconventional in the normal scheme of things, but we're not in the normal scheme of things. We have a Prime Minister who has lost authority, who is too weak to actually stop her cabinet ministers doing this kind of thing. And I think what it shows us is the vulnerability of her position. I personally think she is safe, but it is nonetheless a mark of that vulnerability.
And we heard the Home Secretary there saying she doesn't want Boris Johnson driving the Brexit process, and Tom's told us that he was left out of a key meeting when they were deciding what she would say in Florence. He's the Foreign Secretary. Should he not be weighing in on the biggest foreign policy issue that faces the country?
It is extraordinary to have a Home Secretary say on air that the Foreign Secretary is backseat driving on an issue as big as Brexit. But we are in extraordinary times. I think the most extraordinary, if you step back for a second, is that Theresa May triggered Article 50 without the Cabinet agreeing even amongst themselves on what they wanted to follow. And I think when historians look back at this period, they will be staggered that for purely political reasons, because she said she would do it before the end of March, she did it, and there's no agreement between the senior figures as to what form Brexit should take. There's clearly, as Tom suggests, a deep divide over this transitional phase, so that's the substance of the Boris argument. He wants it to be a shorter transition and less deep. Apart from that, I thought it was a very defensive article. The tone was exuberant, but he's been accused of lying over the national health money. He's been accused of leading Britain towards a calamity with Brexit. And people have been writing, where is he? And to reply...
So this was him answering all of the critics.
Here's 4,000 words, mate, here I am. Brexit can pay for the NHS, and it's going to be great. So in a way, he was replying to all those who've been circling around him in a rather defensive way.
Just want to bring in one other thing before we talk to Damien Green. Stories in the papers today, we mentioned it earlier, about tuition fees and whether or not the government might actually cut. They've just gone up to £9,250, whether they might come down again. Any intel on that, Tom?
Yeah, this is a huge imperative for the government coming into the autumn, perhaps at the budget. They are, I think, quite rightly very keen to sort out what is now a mess with tuition fees, not least because the feeling within government and obviously elsewhere is that students end up paying an absolute fortune for sometimes very poor quality degrees that lead them to low levels of income. And if you, obviously there's an income threshold you need to reach before you start repaying any of that. How they do that, I don't think it is clear yet. The suggestion this morning that the Chancellor wants to reduce it down to 7,500. I think they're going to go for something that ends up linking the quality of the degree with your income. So if you do a good degree, you earn a lot of money, then you're going to pay the full whack. If you don't, you don't. The problem is, how on earth do you do that? Because the simplest way is a graduate tax, and Tories don't like making up new taxes.
Well, we're going to be back talking to all three of you throughout the course of the programme.